What is going on, everybody? So today I'm going to be going over, I guess, stuff that happened over the weekend and just some of the news. And what I'm going to start doing is for my live streams, kind of walking you guys through what I normally do, which what I normally do to gather information for my videos is I just start reading through different articles. My favorite article aggregator or conglomerate is Real Clear Politics. They kind of do a good job of, I think, getting both sides, and you can always end up somewhere in the middle. So I actually really like it because most of the time you will literally see an article that says, Trump is terrible and then Trump is amazing. And you can kind of see the points that different people use in those types of articles that they're writing. So I always find it fascinating. I like it. So it's probably my favorite news aggregator. So I'm going to go over some of the articles that I definitely just find interesting. You're also going to notice kind of how I read some of these articles and how I kind of skim through them, because at the end of the day, a lot of articles nowadays are pretty terrible. What I mean by that is they're very agenda driven, and a lot of them are just kind of repeating facts that have already been said. So it's kind of to read articles, what you really want to do, if you're experienced in reading articles, like I guess I would say I am, is you try to just get whatever the new information is. And that's probably the hardest part, I think, is once you build a base of information and where things are, just from years of reading different articles, following different writers, reading books, you're always kind of looking for like the nugget of new information that they use to catch your attention. And then everything else is just a rehash of a basic talking point that a lot of these reporters, whatever you want to call them, journalists, will use to, I think, kind of catch you. So let me just make sure. Okay, cool. Everything's all good. All right, so let's dive into this, guys. Let's see what we have going on. Morning in America. Morning in America. There's a famous story by the French writer Jean Giono about a man who plants trees in Barren Valley. I already don't care about this article. President Biden has planted a lot of trees during his first 3 years in office, so it's already a pro-Biden article. Pushing through congressional bills that direct the investment of billions of dollars into infrastructure, research, and subsidies for domestic manufacturing. Funny because that's a continuation of Trump's policies. As he begins to ask voters for a second term, Biden can make a strong case for his stewardship, his determination. So COVID talking point. Mr. Biden's reinvigoration of the government's role as the nation's most important investor may endure as a turning point in the nation's political and economic history. What's funny about this is this talking point. It is Mr. Biden's reinvigoration of the government's role as the nation's most important investor that may endure as a turning point in the nation's political and economic history. That is a subtle cue stating that the nation, the United States, the government is the most important investor. What that means is we have to invest in the stock market. We have to invest in, like, I'm not against investing in things like infrastructure. And it is true the government should be doing that. But what about, like, is investing in the stock market, investing in infrastructure? Investments like saplings do not yield immediate fruit. Federal spending on research and development. So this is kind of like a basic talking piece. I already kind of regret clicking on this article, talking about Bill Clinton, talking about his response to COVID-19. I mean, yes, it's the New York Times. So this is a propaganda piece, so not worth reading. So we're going to backtrack. Okay, evening in America. So let's see if this is anti-Biden propaganda. How might we see the effect of the presidential election? Interesting that they're both comparing and contrasting. See, this is why I like this. I already got my left-wing take. I'm assuming this is going to be a right-wing take. There is pessimism about the future as a majority of Americans now believe the next generation is likely to have a lower standard of living. You don't have to believe that. It's true. The Wall Street Journal poll found just 21% of respondents felt confident that their life for their children will be better, matching the record low. Isn't that insane? You know what's fascinating is pessimism and optimism are very good reads of not only the economy, but like just a lot of basics in a culture, and especially in the United States. So, like, for example, if I wanted to respond to this piece, I could say, Yes, Americans feel worse than ever on Americans feel worse than ever on the economy, and they feel terrible for their children. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. And you can make a response stating all these facts about how things are better. But oftentimes, emotion is actually a better read than statistics because emotion is kind of a primal feeling. And if I feel like things are shittier, then they are shittier. And if I feel like things are worse, I'm going to vote like I think things are worse. So if I read some stat that says, well, crime is at a historic low, it doesn't matter if it's actually at a historic low. If I feel like crime is higher, even if it's not, that feeling is what controls my mind. And that's what controls how I vote, how I approach society, my general overall psyche, which is why propaganda is so important because it doesn't matter factually, it matters how you feel. Inflation for more than 2/3 of voting age Americans was the highest in our adult lifetimes. Higher prices mean less spending power. A recent poll on the economy, I wonder who ran that poll, just found 7% of respondents were principally concerned about the availability of jobs, while 64% were most worried about prices. What's the White House concerned about? Jobs, not prices, even to the point where one of its unofficial spokespersons, Paul Krugman, who's an idiot, the New York Times has created a genre for his column scolding Americans for not seeing how great the economy really is. This is a perfect example of the goal of a lot of journalists today is instead of going on, and this is, by the way, what makes a good politician and a bad politician, a good marketer and a bad marketer, a good journalist and a bad journalist. Paul Krugman is just a propaganda talking piece. If you are smart, your job isn't to correct the feeling of people. The reason people feel a certain way is more often than not justified. And even if it's completely made up, you have to go with the way that people feel in order to get a sense of how to help them. And one way to not help people is by saying that bad feeling you have, it's unjustified and you're stupid, which is how Paul Krugman approaches most of his articles. And he's focusing on jobs, which job numbers are very easily manipulated. If you dive into how the United States government labels employment, jobs, and inflation, you will see very quickly that it's just an entire pointless game. And that's something that's always actually really funny because if, like, for example, inflation is defined by a different basket of goods that the United States government determines, they determine what's in that basket. So by determining what's in that basket of goods, that means you can change inflation. So that was what was notorious currently among the Biden administration is anytime they would talk about inflation going down, it's because they changed the basket of goods. They took meat out of there, pork, poultry. At some point they took gas out of there, which is why if you want to like compare and contrast inflation to say the 1970s, the number one thing you want to do is look at that basket of goods that we would measure inflation with from the 1970s onward. How's that basket of goods changed? If you measure current inflation by the basket of goods that we used for that definition in the 1970s, inflation is way higher than it is now, way higher, especially because of food and gas prices. So back to Paul Krugman, he's just an idiot. Things are going well for some, which is true. The richest 1% grabbed nearly 2/3 of all the new wealth since 2020, which aligned perfectly with the pandemic. You guys, I think you've seen some of the articles where the pandemic created a whole new slew of billionaires, and it really was just a wealth transfer. One thing you have to understand is every single recession, depression, economic disaster is a wealth transfer. There are people who get richer. There were people who got richer during the Great Depression. We forget this because we think all of America was poor. No, people actually made tons of money during the Great Depression. And you should actually research and check out who some of those people were and how they got rich during that time. So now we're talking about lack of police. Look at how negative this is. Drugs. Deaths from drugs overdose have almost doubled from 2015 to 2021. Efforts to halt the flow from China of precursors used to make fentanyl have been limited, from blandly bellicose and provocative statements about Taiwan's future to asking Beijing very nicely to stop exporting. One thing I'm always fascinated by is if we wanted to stop, just how we could have stopped opium. Like when the United States took over Afghanistan, we actually allowed them to have their poppy farms, and the Taliban hated poppy farms. And poppy seeds was used to create opium, and opium was fueling the epidemic here in America before fentanyl took off. You almost kind of see that trade, by the way. There's almost a perfect correlation between the opioid and opium epidemic in America and the invasion and pulling out of Afghanistan to the fentanyl epidemic. And it's very interesting because we could stop the fentanyl crisis if we chose to stop it. But that would require us going very hard on China. For some reason, and I wish I could just say, hey, it's a deep state plan to kill Americans and make our nation weaker. But it's more complex than that. It's very weird. I can't quite figure out the exact reason why we have decided to not pursue fentanyl like we should. That means that something that fentanyl is doing in American society is benefiting someone somewhere who must be influential. That's the only thing that I can think of. It's not even a conspiracy. That's just how things work. If something is beneficial to somebody somewhere, if they have a lot of influence, it's one of the reasons why it's not going to stop. Deaths of despair. Life expectancy in the United States has recently fallen for 3 years in a row. Reversal not seen since 1918. This is because of those drug deaths, ODs, and suicides. All going back to, by the way, how Americans feel. If you're criticizing Americans saying, hey, there's more jobs than ever, be happy. Once again, it's not working because we have more drug overdoses and more suicides than ever. We all know our healthcare system's trash. The U.S. now has a lower average life expectancy than Japan, driven by an increase in death rates in young and middle-aged adults, 25 to 64. Wonder what could be causing that. Besides Japan, life expectancy is also lower than Canada, the UK, Iceland, and Hong Kong. Well, I'm kind of surprised the UK's up there. The UK's pretty not so great. Also, Iran, China, Algeria, and Cuba, not the usual peers the U.S. claims. Guns account for about half of the suicides committed by young people. Isn't that funny? Guns account for. It should say half of the suicides are used by a gun, as opposed to guns account for, as if it's like the guns are doing it. Isn't wording funny? While firearms play a large role, clearly there's a mental health crisis fueling it. Mental health-related visits among children, teenagers, and young adults surged between 2011 and 2020 from 4.8 million to 7.5. Isn't that crazy? Mental health. There have been a lot of proposed solutions to the mental health crisis. And what's fascinating is I remember there was a politician in Florida who I was a big fan of, who talked about how we could fund schools to have certain guidance counselors specifically for mental health. And these guidance counselors were kind of meant to be friends to students, so that students would have someone to open up to. And when they did this pilot program, the mental health of the students went up, the visits to the doctor's office went down. And there were actually some examples where they had kids who were like problem children, they would call them, who, if they were to, be an active shooter in a school, these kids would be the ones. And the counselor, because they're in with the students all the time, could pick them out and focus specifically on them to prevent such scenarios. And that's one of the hardest cases to think about, especially in high school and mental health, is like your guidance counselor only sees students who come in to be seen, or if they're forced to be seen. A lot of times what you need a person who is almost following a class to understand the dynamics, figure out who's getting isolated, who's getting bullied, who's kind of on the outskirts, so that you can focus on a person like that and really focus your attention. Because if you notice with a lot of these tragic events, the teachers really supposedly have no clue, or they're just like, oh, he kind of acted strange, but I wasn't too well aware. But if you talk to the students are always like, oh, yeah, we knew from day one that this kid was weird. We bullied him. But you only know that if you get the insider information, and that's by sitting in the classroom. Health is now. I think I'm done with this article. I get the whole point. I'm going to move on to something more fun. Trump doesn't actually speak for the silent majority. Trump poised to win the most black votes. This, I keep hearing, and it's kind of like a Republican myth, that Donald Trump's going to win a bunch of black votes. I think he went from 3% to 8% last election cycle, which guaranteed is huge. One interesting fact is I believe it was Mike Huckabee who actually gained the most black votes of any Republican in history. Let me fact check myself. Mike Huckabee, black vote. Let's see if I'm right on that. I remember reading that. Yeah, Mike Huckabee won 48% of the black vote. And this is such an interesting fact. I find this so fascinating. Oh, it's a YouTube fact. During his re-election campaign as governor, right? Isn't that fascinating? 48%. How did that man do it? Let's see. Oh, this is on Reddit. Why were Mike Huckabee and George Voinovich so successful with black voters, and what can other Republicans do to replicate their success? Support Obama, Romney, McCain, blah, blah. I think this issue is comparing apples to oranges, comparing local elections, presidential elections. So the way Mike Huckabee ran his state, he was very religious, obviously, and he really focused on family issues, which worked on the local governor level. Obviously, it's a different dynamic than when you're running for president. As a governor, Huckabee was openly evangelical. He was progressive in foreign policy, preferring more ring tips on the ground than combat boots. This is important to low-income voters in Arkansas who make up the majority of the National Guard. Isn't that interesting? This was just post-Desert Storm. Huckabee was seen as a compassionate conservative. You see that term a lot, and it's a way for conservatives to try to not be so radical in their marketing. Compassionate conservative. It's good. It rolls off the tongue. He presented a bill to allow undocumented students who graduated from high schools to pay in-state tuition. He pushed through covenant marriage and abstinence-only education. He stood up against the far right, especially the Northwest Arkansas dynamic duo Jim Holt and Jim Bob Duggar. Pay attention to pop culture. Duggar is the same Duggar of 19 Kids and the Counting on TLC. Interesting. So he was kind of a moderate in Arkansas. I guess he was pretty likable. So going back to Donald Trump poised to win the most black votes than any Republican in history, I guess it's on the presidential side because there's no way he would beat Mike Huckabee in that. According to national and swing state polls reviewed by Bloomberg, the former president GOP frontrunner has between 14 and 30% of the black vote share as the country heads into election year. His bond, the 8%, I was right. The Pew Research said the Republican won in 2020. 3 to 8%, pretty big leap. And I think the stats I remember reading, they were like, if any Republican on the presidential candidacy gets more than like 10% of black votes, Democrats can't win. I don't know how true that is because obviously elections in America are so decentralized. it would have to be enough black votes in a certain state, for example. NAACP estimated that 5 million African Americans voted in the 1960 presidential election for Richard Nixon, won 32%. Since then, black voting population increased to 10%, 19 million people. Black turnout has barely increased at all. Wow. This means if Trump wins more than 13% of the vote share, he will gain the highest proportion of black votes since Nixon in 1960. And more individual black votes. But, yeah, look at this. On the other hand, attracted 92%. So Biden still got 92% of the black vote. So it's really just on the margin. But the most important thing is when you're in the political game, everything's about building coalitions. And people try open tent campaigns. It doesn't always work. There's always give and take. And you're always kind of sacrificing one voting block for another. And it's really complicated. It's a lot harder than you think. So the big question is, if Trump hones in on African Americans, on blacks for voting, what is that detracting from? Is it detracting from anything? Because in order to gain a subset of any population, you have to cater to them and use certain talking points, but the talking points used on one population might turn off others. So there's kind of a fine medium. The assumption would be, though, that maybe people are so disaffected with Biden that they're switching sides. But a lot of times what happens is that's not true. When people are disaffected with a certain political group, sometimes they just end up not voting. And that's actually really insanely popular for some people, is to just not vote. And that's your way of showing that you don't approve of the current administration. Black males especially cite prices of basic needs, food, for example, despite the decline in inflation. Some who are small business owners say under Trump, it was easier for them to get federal loans, for example. They also cite the backlash against police accountability measures as the George Floyd murder discussion has receded into sunset. It's really interesting because you have events like George Floyd, which will obviously shift the conversation one way. But as that talking point kind of subsides in the media hype cycle, then the implications of the decisions that were made during that hype cycle start to set in, and people might still be unhappy. Now, the big question is, if you were an African American or if you were a black person who's a part of the voting population, and you had a candidate who says, I am pro-police and, I think the police did nothing wrong during George Floyd, and you look at that statement, you're obviously going to think, okay, that is not my guy. But what do you do when you actually like some of the policy proposals of, increased funding for police, because that's what is affecting your specific community, is the police are no longer doing their job. So how do you balance hating someone's talking point as a voter and thinking about the practicality of what that might mean for your personal situation? Unfortunately, most people don't think like that. Most people will simply see the media and the marketing and the talking point and not think about the implication, because most voters aren't strategic like that. They're just based off of whatever the propaganda talking point is. So more than likely, if someone came out and say that they were, against the George Floyd riots or didn't phrase it correctly, they're not going to vote for that guy. So that's why these talking points are so incredibly important. I mean, most people aren't reading these articles anyway. They're not thinking about this kind of stuff. A certain class of people are, but it doesn't. That class of people who is reading articles is not necessarily all that smart. Yeah, so I think I get the point on most of this. Is, even since 2016, there's been a lot of talk about Trump getting the black vote. Went from 3% to 8%. So if that trajectory follows, yeah, he could get more in 2024. What matters is where he gets those votes. right? Is that enough to swing a swing state? Because that's what's going to matter more than anything. Let's look at the 2024 election. I love looking at the DeSantis and Trump stuff because obviously I like things about DeSantis and I like things about Trump, and it's still kind of a tragedy that they're running against each other. I think that's stupid, but Iowa's a big thing, and we're going to know about it at the end of this month, finally. Don't tell Governor DeSantis he is an underdog, as the Iowa caucus is appropriate. He rang in a new year, rallying Republicans in state to put him on a glide path to the party's 2024 presidential nomination. I think we have an opportunity to just make a statement that in this country, it's we the people that ultimately decide these things, he said. He being DeSantis. Because I think you have a lot of media, they don't think you even matter. DeSantis is betting that the voters in Iowa matter a lot. As his national standing has faded, he's even increasingly counting on Iowa to rejuvenate his presidential prospects when caucus goers convene on January 15th. Yeah, that's right around the corner. Former President Trump ended 2023 at 63% in a poll. DeSantis' numbers were 14 and 11, respectively. In the later poll, DeSantis tied former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, for a distant second place. It's tough. It's almost like 2015 where there's just enough people in the field here to, I think, hurt DeSantis' chance in Iowa. If Nikki Haley dropped out, I guarantee you most of those Nikki Haley votes would go to DeSantis and not Trump. And that'd boost him. That'd probably double his numbers. At least give him like another 8 percentage points. But no actual voting has happened as of this writing. Yeah. Yeah, they're really Iowa's going to be interesting because what'll happen if DeSantis wins is they're hoping that they can ride that hype cycle, and then all the betting and everything will be, oh, DeSantis is going to win this time. You know, this is his moment. He has the momentum. And then you try to ride that into New Hampshire. Big problem is a lot of people win Iowa who don't win the presidency. And what's even worse is you have to then win New Hampshire so that your momentum doesn't die. And if your momentum dies, then your Iowa win was a pointless win. So right now it looks like Nikki Haley could win New Hampshire. And by win, I mean come in second place. What that would look like is, because the goal of Iowa is to get people to drop out and endorse you. And so Iowa could be where a Vivek drops out and endorses somebody, but Vivek would probably only endorse Trump, right? That's why I don't think a lot of people are actually going to be voting for Vivek, because the people who like Vivek are probably just going to vote for Trump. Big assumption there, but that's my best guess. Yeah, and then the rest of this article is just kind of going into how terrible DeSantis' campaign has been, right? And that's why they're betting so big on Iowa. Yeah, DeSantis has worked Iowa really well, visited all the counties, constant town halls. But there's this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy that a lot of people don't think about. And self-fulfilling prophecy is this idea like whoever you think is going to win will most likely win. And that's a really important kind of psyop propaganda piece. That's why polls are manipulated the way that they are. And you could even argue some people do that the polls are manipulated for Trump. No, I'm not entirely sure that they are, but it's hard. I know most polls are BS anyway, so you can go by polls, but the best thing to do is go by like the feeling. And to be honest, like if you really wanted a feeling of how things are going in Iowa, you'd have to go to like an Iowa barbershop or just ask random people at an Iowa Walmart or, you know, whatever the places go in Iowa are. You just go and ask and be like, who do you think? And then so anecdotal data is the best that you could do, because online is just not real. Data can be manipulated so appropriately. But the thing is, other people in Iowa might see that data, might see the polls and be like, well, I like DeSantis, but look at the polls. Trump's obviously going to win. So, why waste my vote? I'm going to vote for Trump. I want to be a part of the team that wins. And it's kind of, like I said, it's using self-fulfilling prophecy in order to win elections. No one wants to be a part of a losing team. No one wants to say, oh, yeah, I backed DeSantis and then he lost, right? You want to be like, no, I've always backed Trump. I knew he was going to win, and he did win, And so it's like a lot of emotional, psychological feeling. That's why in 2016, everyone was saying Hillary Clinton was going to win. Because also, if you think Hillary Clinton's going to win, why try voting for the other guy? So there are some parallels there that I can see the DeSantis team obviously trying to make, but things are slightly different in a primary, and I think things are slightly different now because since 2015 we've been in the Trump show, right? And I think we have to see the end of the Trump show, and I don't think the universe is going to have that ending be he loses the Republican primary, as cheesy as that sounds. So let's move on to another article. Let's actually go to World. That's kind of what I want to look at. And guys, if you're watching, if you're in the chat, feel free to leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let's see. Israel, and Ukraine, and that's all anyone's talking about. Taiwan hits the polls. This is interesting. Taiwan's presidential candidates have entered their final stretch. Ahead of this month's election, the outcome of the January 13th contest will play a crucial role in shaping the island's relationship with China. No way. With cross-strait ties at their tensest, the stakes couldn't be higher, not only for Beijing and Taipei, but the latter's most committed security partner, the United States. So Taiwan is a great place to watch China and America fight. And I'm not talking about a hot war. I'm talking about a cold war. I guarantee that there's boots on the ground, spies, agents, money being funneled to both parties to get the support. Even if you can imagine in Taiwan, even if everyone hates China there, which they don't, but if everyone hates China, you might have a moderate who's like, I like the US, but we should trade with China. And just being slightly moderate could get you a bunch of Chinese funding. Vice President Lai Ching-te of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party has led the field, but his election is far from certain. Recent opinion polls show him at an uninspiring 35%, followed closely by Hu Yaoi of the Kuomintang KMT at 29%, a narrow margin given Taiwan less than precise polling. Ko Wen-je of the upstart Taiwan People's Party, that's funny, trails at just 24%. But he's a political survivor whose popularity may not be fully reflected in the polls. So who's the pro-American and who's the pro-China? Well, from an American perspective, the overwhelming issue in this election is a threat from China. The saying that all politics are local applies, of course. Race will ultimately go to the candidate greatest number of voters trust to deal with the many socioeconomic challenges plaguing Taiwan, such as sky-high housing prices, perpetual underemployment, and energy shortages. Where the election will likely have a truly consequential impact is in cross-strait relations and Taiwan's resulting security environment, but this won't be shaped so much by the next president as it will by Beijing's reaction to their election and governing agenda. Contrary to conventional wisdom, the various parties aren't far apart on their approach to China. The KMT is not a pro-Beijing party in favor of unification, as some seek to portray it. But see, if they're the moderate, then that's what gets you the Chinese funding. And that is also exactly it's what happens over here. If you're even slightly moderate, they'll just say you're a pro-Chinese party. which pushes you in the Chinese camp, which then once again becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even if a staunchly pro-independence or pro-unification figure managed to get elected, Taiwan has constitutional and legal mechanisms that make it nearly impossible for a president to radically change the island's status. I bet you the United States helped develop those constitutional and legal mechanisms, but I can't prove that. Just a hunch. Beijing, however, draws a sharp contrast between the candidates. China deeply distrusts the DPP, and its Taiwan strategy consists of a large part of seeking to oppose and delegitimize the party and its leaders in favor of the KMT, which Beijing feels more comfortable engaging. This means if Lai is elected, China's military provocations and diplomatic isolation tactics will almost certainly continue. There's little Lai can do about this, short of the politically suicidal task of changing his party's nominally pro-independence charter and recognizing the 1992 consensus. The latter refers to an agreement by which the KMT and Chinese Communist Party affirmed that there is just one China, but never defined what that meant. Which means Taiwan could say, yeah, we're the one China. Beijing insists on the consensus as the basis for cross-strait dialogue. So when is this election? Because this election, so January 13th, that's going to be this week? It's going to determine a lot. And what's interesting is that'll become a U.S. presidential talking point, I'm sure, especially if China does anything risky. A lot of things that happen in this world are dependent upon elections and countries just waiting on elections in order to know how to respond. And no doubt that China will respond in some way, shape, or form, depending on who's elected. I wouldn't be surprised if there are protests, even if they're fake and like color revolution like protests in Taiwan, but because that's obviously one of the easiest ways to kind of cause havoc and delegitimize any, I think, currently or newly elected official is immediately to have protests. And you see that happen in the United States, but you see that happen in practically every democratic country that isn't cracking down and trying to kill its citizens. There's normally a protest when someone's elected. All right, pretty lackluster, boring article. What's interesting, I think, is Israel now going really hard against Hezbollah. Hezbollah claims top commander killed in Israeli airstrike in Lebanon, which is crazy to think that Israel is just bombing Lebanon. The Iran-backed terrorist group Hezbollah said Monday that one of its top commanders has been killed in an airstrike. Always traveling in a car. Be careful who you travel in a car with, guys. Ongoing cross-border skirmishes between Israel's military and Hezbollah has left more than 130 of the militant's group fighters dead. What's fascinating to me is I really thought that Hezbollah was going to attack Israel within the first 2 weeks of the original kind of Gaza invasion of the Palestinians attacking Israel and then Israel's response, because that was the height of full chaos. So I really, really thought strategically, if there was any time to attack Israel from Hezbollah's perspective, it would have been during that time period. And it looked like they were getting ready to do so, but obviously that is not what happened. And I'm still kind of confused and surprised at why that is. I wish I could be a fly on the wall, but I guess maybe Hezbollah wasn't prepared themselves. To me, that's weird, because if Iran helped with the project in Gaza and Hezbollah is just, an arm of Iran, why wouldn't there have been some coordinated effort? So that's really interesting. I wish I knew the answer to that, but those are the types of questions you guys should be asking. Putin's unsustainable spending spree. Ooh, this looks interesting. What's he been spending his money on? Blah, 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 blah. Boring stuff. No, I'm not going to subscribe. So the latter is forecast by the IMF to grow 3%. The former is predicated by the Russian government to grow by 3.5%. When the exact figures come in, Russia's economic growth in 2023 will likely to turn out to have exceeded 3%. No doubt because of oil and gas and being able to charge out the wazoo for it. Putin will no doubt boast about this in speeches ahead of his spring's presidential election. You will notice that a lot of countries that have the ability to do this are moving their elections sooner rather than later. I don't think it's any coincidence that countries that are either very strategically aligned with the United States or are starting to shift away from the United States are holding their elections soon. Egypt being another one that they're calling rush elections for. That is because they want to solidify support before stuff really goes crazy in the United States around the 2024 election cycle and who wins here. And so I think the world has viewed the American empire as kind of evil at its evilest and at its weakest as of, I think, right now. And so they will probably go off that sentiment to gain support. Not that they need support if you're a quasi dictatorship, right? But still, the propaganda matters, right? But then it also means you don't have to worry about any shenanigans in an election when you need to make some very tough choices based on the US's election. Because our elections literally shape the globe. Our election in 2020 shaped what's going on in Ukraine right now, for example. Actually, I would argue our elections in 2012 and shaped what's going on in Ukraine right now. I guess I could go far as back as Bush. I think it was Bush who was really stupid around Ukraine as well. Ahead of the Russian election, Putin is unlikely to mention that over a third of Russia's growth is due to the war, with defense-related industries flourishing at a double-digit growth rate. Civilian industries, which are also involved in producing products for the front, such as footwear, clothing, medicine, lag slightly behind. Yeah, so war front economies can do well depending on the purpose, especially in a fiat system. But you also have to remember that who is supporting Russia in this war. So it's not just Russia alone. So it might be Iran, it might be China, it might be North Korea. So it kind of gives the economy a reason to start investing in infrastructure, which, I mean, that's a common argument that we have in the United States, that infrastructure always has a good ROI. And that's just building bridges, building roads. So if Russia is having to use the war as an excuse to upgrade infrastructure, certainly the economic argument would be, well, that growth can't last forever, right? There's a lot of economic data and arguments about the amount of money you spend on infrastructure now will increase growth now, but hurt growth later. Some people argue against that, but it is a common talking point. That's one of the reasons why certain American elites will say, do not spend money on infrastructure because it will hurt long-term growth. But that's what we're seeing here in Russia. So, and that's kind of what this article is hinting at, that their pro-war economy is actually helping due to infrastructure increases. The big question is, how long will that last? That's a question I can't answer for you, but I have a feeling it could last for quite some time, because if Russia is using this infrastructure to then benefit other relationships and strategically lock down other relationships, which are encouraging trade, like with Saudi Arabia, like with the Middle East, like with China, then it might play off and actually help them. That's why infrastructure spending is so hard to measure, because it matters what the infrastructure spending is on. In the United States, we talk about roads and bridges, but if you look at where the actual infrastructure spending goes, it's to a lot of useless crap, unfortunately. But if it was used to really help Americans in a lot of ways, then there could be positive economic growth factors from that. And once again, tying back to propaganda and the feeling, if Americans feel better because roads are better, because stuff looks prettier, that is an economic output that you can't necessarily measure, but we do know that happier people do better and are more motivated in general. So that's kind of like esoteric infrastructure spending, I guess you could say, which is an argument for why we should be spending infrastructure on maybe making things more beautiful. And I think you could economically back that, but no one, who cares about that, especially if you have two jobs? Oh, we're printing money to make things prettier. I'm not sure that's a favorable thing that Americans want to hear. What else can we look at? What else is it? Blinken to meet Saudi Crown Prince before heading to Israel. This is interesting because Saudi Arabia has essentially started pushing away from the United States because they know that they can. they're starting to become like another Turkey where they realize that they can play a lot of sides. And they're realizing that they're not completely strategically aligned with the United States like they were, but we're still heavily a part of, Saudi Arabia. So these changes are very slow over time, but you can kind of read the tea leaves and get these little hints. That's why reading some of these articles is really good, because you're like, okay, what's this article is going to tell us, one thing, but then let's kind of look behind the scenes. So Anthony Blinken met Monday with Saudi Arabia as a part of efforts to stop the Gaza war spiraling into a regional conflict. What that tells you is Saudi Arabia not a fan of what Israel's doing, and Saudi Arabia is going to use their leverage to potentially back away from certain things that they want to do with Israel, which has already kind of happened. Blinken was expected to discuss Red Sea attacks by Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen, Saudi Arabia's southern neighbor, during his talks with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. What's interesting is Saudi Arabia has hated the Houthis, but I don't know if Saudi Arabia is really trying to prevent now the Houthis from targeting, for example, Israeli or U.S. vessels. Obviously, all that matters is money to a lot of people, but still, it's a highly religious society, and you can't do certain things that are going to make your people really hate you. And Saudi Arabia is all about a popularity contest when you have hundreds of princes who could usurp you, right? So you have to be very careful, even as a powerhead in Saudi Arabia. Talks were also to touch on potential normalization of ties with Israel after initial discussions were put on hold, right? And putting them on hold is a bigger deal than you think, because it kills momentum. And momentum is what matters in relationships, especially between countries. The Obama-Iran nuclear deal was all about momentum. Trump killed that momentum when he came into office and pulled out, right? Everything takes momentum, which momentum is easily crushed depending on how you crush it. And that's why geopolitical relationship building is so hard sometimes. There has to be clear-cut incentives and momentum for people to act a certain way. The United States and Lebanon warned of unspecified consequences of attacks. Situation is tense for Riyadh as it coincides with attempts to settle a long-running war between the Houthi and Saudi-led international coalition. Right, so the Saudis might try to play this as, we'll start talking to Israel again if you finally help us crush the Houthis so that we have control over Yemen. If I was Saudi Arabia, that's what I would be saying. I'd be like, oh, you want me to talk to the Israelis again, which is not politically great for us at home? Well, you need to give us a win. And that win needs to be that Saudi Arabia has essentially total control over Yemen. And I bet you that's what they're going to try to do, even if it's through proxies. All right, let's look at energy. Anything cool here? Not really. Maybe you guys are new to some of this, but I've been hearing about EVs and nuclear energy now for so long. It's just like, ugh, I don't care until something new and cool comes out. Space Force targeting unit develops strike options for Joint Force. U.S. DoD deploys F-35s across armed forces in a deal worth $1.1 billion. Congratulations. SOCOM looking for a new long-range sniper rifle. Russia has the upper hand in electronic warfare with Ukraine. That's interesting. Damn you, paywall. Why are they always trying to hide knowledge? Confidence in Austin despite hospitalization. So this is really weird. And I was only kind of caught on to this, but Secretary of Defense of Austin was put in the hospital for 3 days and I guess didn't tell anybody, which begs a lot of questions. Who is making the decisions? Why didn't they tell anybody? The Secretary of Defense is in the chain line of command for the presidency in case, stuff goes really bad. The news that the U.S. Department of Defense failed to inform the American public that its Secretary of Defense was hospitalized for 4 days represents a stunning breach of transparency standards. This is going to sound terrible, but you do have to think, if you're main guy of a war effort, is publicly hospitalized, their thinking is going to be, is that going to encourage Iran or Russia or China to make a certain move when the guy who's running everything is now in the hospital? Um, so we often look at things like transparency and go, oh, well, they weren't very transparent. Where it gets complicated is when you view transparency as a bad thing for national security. I'm not saying either is good or bad, but a case can be made for both sides, right? However, on the transparency side, there should be people under Secretary Austin who are so well informed that, it can be available for him to go to the hospital, and they just say, hey, so and so's in charge now. So this almost makes it look worse. The issue may have died there, but the subterfuge further grew the story. Additional reporting revealed some critical details not released. Austin was in inpatient intensive care, generally reserved for those in immediate danger. Meanwhile, his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, was vacationing in Puerto Rico. Aha. So, yeah, that's a big problem. She should have been notified and brought immediately back to D.C., right? Who is adjudicating the Pentagon's support for the war in Gaza? Who is coordinating with his Israeli defense minister? Who approved the January 4th strike in Baghdad that killed a militia leader believed responsible for attacks on American troops? Yeah, so who was in control? Which is an interesting statement, because if you can figure out who's in control while this guy's in the hospital and the deputies in Puerto Rico, maybe that's the same person who's in control already. And that's kind of where you try to read the tea leaves. Now they're just asking a whole lot of questions. With a press statement about Austin, yeah. Lloyd Austin cannot recover from his breach of trust. In fact, he cannot be trusted any longer. If he wants to keep his hospital visits private, he should be allowed to as a private citizen. Nothing's going to happen to the guy unless his health attack was really so bad that he has to resign. But I don't see anything happening there. It's kind of cool. SOCOM looking for new long-range sniper rifle. This is completely pointless, but special operation with their longest range sniper rifle ever fielded in an effort to maintain superiority against Russian and Chinese snipers in future potential conflict. According to a new notice, USSOCOM is conducting research for a so-called extreme long-range sniper rifle. What's going to be incredible is when we start putting AI in military scopes, because obviously a military scope is entirely based upon the accuracy of the shooter. But what if AI is able to automatically adjust things for the person through the scope? That's an interesting concept. This gives you a hint of the way that warfare is shaping up, by the way, because warfare, there is no clear-cut front lines anymore, which means the best ability you can have, especially in urban warfare, is snipers. You see that in World War II. You see that in Afghanistan, which simulates the city through mountains, where snipers are king, right? And so I think that tells you, I think the future of warfare is long-range snipers, miniature drones, and dirt bikes. So you're going to have all these decentralized outfits in order to counter not only bigger centralized systems, but to also navigate easier through urban warfare. And I think the most important thing in urban warfare is transportation and optics. And when I say optics, I really mean like having your bearings on a situation, knowing what's where in a city. So a sniper with a drone, a sniper team where one's a sniper and then one has a miniature drone or multiple miniature drones, I think is the key to taking over any large city probably in the future, I would bet. And then how are they going to get around quickly? Probably small dirt bikes. But you have to think, you need to disrupt supply chains. And because we have the ability now to strike people from anywhere with large drones, the only way to counter that is if it's almost like you have 100 people all on their own individual dirt bike who can spread out and not be targeted in a straight line. I know that sounds stupid, but I read an article about dirt bikes a little while back that I thought was pretty badass. Aha, the time has come to fix the Supreme Court. No. So anytime you see anyone trying to edit the Supreme Court, it's just because they don't like the current power structure of the Supreme Court and everything's a hit piece on the Supreme Court. Now we have a Roberts Court shaped by pro-corporate ideology and conservative resentment over social and demographic change. Tells me everything I need to know about the rest of the article. So what do they want to do? They either want to stack it or they want to regulate it so heavily that people get kicked out. So let's see. Merrick Garland bringing that up. And two, the pair published a law review on how to save the Supreme Court. Blah, 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 blah. Today, the court is viewed by an arm of the Republican Party. No way. And when it rules another way, it's viewed as an arm of the Democratic Party. Such are things. The real goal in the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court was the last institution to be politically charged and motivated that the Americans trusted. So Congress, trust fell. Presidency, trust fell. But the Supreme Court was kind of always up there. Now that's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court has been targeted so heavily is whoever it is has to target all American institutions and make all American institutions delegitimate. And once every American institution is delegitimized, that's when you have chaos and really bad situations on the horizon. To fix the court in a durable way, the two scholars imagine a total rework meant to make partisan capture almost impossible. Once again, that's propaganda. That just means you don't like who's currently in power. First step was to expand it, appointing every circuit court judge, all 179 of them, and associate justices, which would hear cases on a rotating panel system. This is hilarious. It's actually a very interesting idea. That would turn the Supreme Court into almost another Senate-like structure. And the more people you add to a system, the slower it is, the more bogged down it is. That would, a very interesting idea. Talk about decline. A very interesting idea. Every 2 weeks, 9 justices would be picked by a lottery from the larger pool. See, then you argue, well, what's the pool? What if that pool of people is mostly red or mostly blue? Even if it's a probability, the higher the probability forever the majority of those justices that are randomly picked. No more than 5 judges on a panel could be appointed by a president of the same party, and to rule federal law unconstitutional would require 6-3 majority. That's not a lot. Rule federal law unconstitutional. This change was meant to counteract a structural weakness that makes the court vulnerable to political machinations. Partisans in Congress, for instance, would have less incentive to game the appointment process if each seat mattered less. So delegitimizing the Supreme Court by making it less impactful, which then would give the presidency and Congress more power than the Supreme Court, actually. Which is interesting because the presidency and Congress may actually support something like this because it would increase their own power. This is such an interesting, crazy plan. How fascinating. Well, guys, that's it for today. I am going to actually end my live. Hopefully you enjoyed it, but it just gives you a basic idea of the news of the day, some of the topics of the day. The most fascinating thing that you probably need to note is the articles that you read on a Monday are often going to lead up to what certain people want to espouse later in the week. So what that means is no matter what the media cycle, what you read on Monday is sometimes going to be the foundation for what you see. So the next big thing that happens this week, they might actually just rewrite one of these articles and then post in whatever the most current thing is to get you to read it, to reiterate their ideas. But I use this as a process for myself to figure out what I want to talk about, what my opinions are on certain things. And so that's why I'm going to start doing these lives more to kind of give you guys an in-depth process inside my head on how I make my content and how I do these videos. So thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment. If you have any questions about what I talked about today, please feel free to comment below and I will answer any question that you have.